Story 1. Anna had always believed her marriage was solid, the kind of relationship others envied, built on trust, laughter, and over a decade of memories, but everything shattered the night her phone rang at 11:47 p.m. She was already in bed, half asleep, when the unknown number flashed across her screen, and for reasons she couldn't explain, an uneasy feeling settled in her chest as she answered. "Is this Anna?" a woman's voice asked, hesitant yet urgent. When Anna confirmed, the next words sent an icy chill down her spine. "I think we have the same husband." At first, she thought it was some kind of prank, a cruel joke in poor taste, but something in the woman's trembling voice made her sit up straight. "What are you talking about?" Anna demanded, her heart now pounding in her ears. "Tea." The woman introduced herself as Emily and claimed she had been married to Daniel, Anna's husband, for 5 years. 5 years. That was impossible. Daniel was with her for the last 12 years, always by her side, sharing a home, a life, a future. The room seemed to tilt as Emily continued, her voice filled with hesitant sorrow. "I found a bank statement," she explained, "and there were withdrawals in your town, under his name. I confronted him, and he denied everything, but I kept digging. I found you." Anna felt sick. The rational part of her mind screamed that this had to be a mistake, but her gut twisted with the undeniable truth something was off. "Prove it," Anna whispered, barely able to speak. A moment later, her phone buzzed with a message and image of Emily standing next to Daniel, his arm draped over her shoulder, his smile as familiar as the one he gave Anna every morning. Her stomach lurched. She wanted to scream, to wake up from this nightmare, but her hands moved on their own, scrolling through more pictures, each one a stab to her heart. How had she been so blind? How had he managed to live this double life without her noticing? Anna needed answers. She needed the truth. She needed to see Daniel's face when she confronted him. So she did something she never imagined. She invited Emily to town. The two women met in a small coffee shop, an eerie reflection of each other's pain mirrored in their tired eyes. They compared notes, cross-checking every lie he had fed them, and the horrifying reality took shape. Daniel had been bouncing between them, using business trips as his excuse. He had 2 apartments, to lives, to women who loved him. But the worst part, he had plans to disappear. Emily found emails in which he had been looking into flights to a country neither of them had ever discussed visiting. He was getting ready to run. Rage replaced Anna's heartbreak, and together they formed a plan. That night, when Daniel returned home, Anna greeted him with a soft smile, pretending nothing was wrong. She watched him move through their house like he belonged there, and for a moment, she almost doubted herself. Almost. Then came the knock at the door. Daniel frowned, confused, as Anna casually said, "Oh, that must be for you." When he opened the door, his face drained of all color, there stood Emily, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Hi, honey," she said coldly. Anna saw the flicker of pure panic in his eyes, the way his mind raced for an escape. "What's wrong, Daniel?" she asked sweetly. "Aren't you happy to see your wife?" His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The trap was set. He was caught. What followed was an explosion of rage, denial, pleading, all the classic tactics of a man who had lost control. But Anna and Emily stood their ground, revealing every lie, every hidden account, every secret uncovered. And then, just when he thought it couldn't get worse, Anna pulled out her final card. She had already called the police. It turned out Daniel had committed financial fraud, forging documents to keep both marriages afloat. Within an hour, officers arrived, and as they placed the cuffs around his wrists, he locked eyes with Anna, his face twisted in something between fury and desperation. "I loved you," he choked out. Anna tilted her head, the last of her tears long gone. "No, Daniel," she whispered. "You love getting away with it." As he was dragged away, Emily let out a shaky breath. "So, what now?" Anna thought for a moment before a slow, knowing smile spread across her lips. "Now, We rebuild, and for the first time in a long time, she felt free. Story 2. Mark had always prided himself on being the kind of man who was always in control, the sharpest mind in any room, the strategist, the one who dictated the terms of every deal, every business move, and, most importantly, every relationship. For 18 years, he had been married to Olivia, a woman who, to everyone on the outside, seemed like the perfect, devoted wife. She was poised, elegant, supportive, and never once questioned him. She attended charity galas on his arm, smiled in family Christmas photos, and played the role of a loving spouse flawlessly. But to Mark, she was nothing more than a silent accessory, a woman who had been easy to control, easy to manipulate, and easy to keep financially dependent. He had always made sure she had just enough of an allowance to buy her designer clothes, just enough of a budget to keep her happy, just enough access to his wealth to keep her satisfied, but never enough to be independent. She was a chess piece in his life, one that he had always assumed would never move without his permission. So, when he met someone younger, someone fresh, someone who made him feel powerful again, he didn't even hesitate. Filing for divorce was just another business transaction for him, another calculated decision where he would dictate the terms, and Olivia would quietly accept whatever he gave her. He had seen it play out 100 times with his wealthy friends. These women never fought back. They cried, they begged, but in the end, they took whatever scraps they were offered and walked away, leaving their ex-husbands to move on to newer, shinier replacements. And Olivia had never been the confrontational type. She wasn't ambitious, wasn't career-driven. Hell, she had spent the last 18 years playing the role of the doting housewife. So, when she signed the divorce papers without protest, Mark barely gave it a second thought. He smirked as she walked out of his office, her face unreadable, her posture eerily calm. Good, that was easy. With her gone, he could move on, enjoy his wealth without the burden of an aging wife dragging him down. He celebrated that night, drinking expensive whiskey in his penthouse, already planning the honeymoon he would take with his new girlfriend. He thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. At first, the signs were subtle, almost unnoticeable. His personal assistant quit abruptly, citing an opportunity that had come out of nowhere. His financial advisor became harder to reach, suddenly too busy to return his calls. Then, one evening, he went to his vacation home, a luxurious estate on the coast where he had taken his new girlfriend for the weekend, and found an eviction notice on the door. Confused, furious, he called his lawyer, demanding to know what the hell was going on. That's when he heard the words that made his stomach drop. "Mark, you don't own that house anymore." His grip tightened on the phone. "What the hell do you mean I don't own it?" The answer was something he had never anticipated, never even thought to consider. Olivia had bought it. Using the years of allowance he had given her, Olivia had quietly started investing, first in small stocks, then in real estate, then in businesses. She had used her connections Mark had foolishly assumed were meaningless to slowly build her own empire, right under his nose. But that was just the beginning. As he scrambled to regain control, he dug deeper and found that Olivia hadn't just taken his vacation home. She had acquired shares in his company, legally, silently. Over the years, she had used third-party investors, slowly buying up percentages of the very business he had built from the ground up. And now she owned 30%. Mark felt the walls closing in, but he wasn't done fighting. He was still a shark, still the man who had outmaneuvered every competitor in the business world. He would crush Olivia in court, strip her of every penny, expose whatever illegal loopholes he could find to ensure she walked away with nothing. He called his high-profile divorce attorney a ruthless man who had won him countless corporate battles. But when he walked into the courtroom expecting a victory, his confidence shattered. Sitting beside Olivia, calm and composed, was John Lancaster, the John Lancaster, one of the most feared divorce attorneys in the country. A man who had destroyed CEOs, obliterated billionaires, and left powerful men in financial ruin, a man Mark himself had once tried to hire, only to be told he was unavailable. Now, Mark knew why Olivia had beaten him to it. The trial was brutal, public, and humiliating. Every dirty financial move Mark had made, every hidden asset, every unethical business deal, it was all dragged into the light. Olivia had spent years collecting evidence, and now she was using it to dismantle him piece by piece. By the time it was over, the judge's ruling was devastating. Olivia was granted a massive settlement, ownership of several properties, a substantial percentage of Mark's company, and a legal right to keep every asset she had acquired during their marriage. The woman he had once controlled, dismissed, underestimated, she had just destroyed him. Weeks later, as Mark sat alone in his now half-empty penthouse, staring at the pile of legal bills he could barely afford, he finally understood. Olivia had never been weak. She had never been naive. She had simply been waiting. She had played the long game, and she had won. And as he took a slow, shaky sip of his whiskey, he realized that for the first time in his life, he was the one who had been outplayed. Story 3. Lisa had spent 20 years believing in forever. She and David had built a life together, 2 kids, a home filled with laughter and memories, late-night conversations about growing old side by side. Their love wasn't perfect, but it was steady, dependable, something she thought was uncheckable until the day she found the letter. It was buried deep in the attic, tucked inside a dusty box of old papers, one she almost didn't open. At first, she thought it was something insignificant, an old bill, a forgotten note, but then she saw her name, written in David's familiar handwriting, and her heart stopped. The date on the envelope was from 10 years ago. Hands trembling, she opened it, the paper worn and delicate from age. As she read the first few lines, her stomach twisted. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't a note of appreciation or a forgotten anniversary card. It was a confession. Lisa, by the time you read this, I don't know if I'll still be here, but there's something I have to say. I love you. I always have. But I'm not in love with you anymore. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She kept reading, her breath shallow, her pulse thundering in her ears. I've felt this way for a long time, but I stayed. I stayed because of the kids. I stayed because I didn't want to hurt you. I stayed because I was afraid of what life would look like without you. But I've been lying to myself. I've been lying to you, and I don't know how much longer I can do it. Lisa's hands clenched around the letter, crumpling the edges. She couldn't breathe. How long had he been pretending? Had every kiss, every I love you, every shared moment been a lie? Had she been sleeping beside a stranger for 10 years? Her mind raced back over the last decade, birthday parties, family vacations, quiet Sunday mornings with coffee and newspapers. Had all of it been a performance? She had thought they were happy. She had thought they were real. But the worst part, the part that shattered her, was the realization that she had felt it too. The distance, the quiet sadness that neither of them ever spoke about. The way their conversations had become routine, their intimacy fading into something more like familiarity than passion. She had told herself it was just a phase, that all marriages had their ebbs and flows. But deep down, she had known, and yet she had stayed, just like he had. They had both been pretending, both trapped in the comfort of what was safe, too afraid to confront what was true. Slowly, she folded the letter, her heart aching. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a revelation. David hadn't left. He had never followed through. He had chosen to stay. But was that love, or was it fear? That night, Lisa sat across from him at the dinner table, watching him the way she hadn't in years. He looked older, more tired. Had he always looked this way? Or had she only just noticed? He smiled at her between bites of food, the same familiar smile he had given her for years, and for the first time, she questioned it. "What's wrong?" he asked. The words hovered on her tongue. "I found the letter. I know everything." But instead, she swallowed them. Not yet. Not until she knew what she wanted to do with them. Over the next few days, she watched him, studied him, listened to every word he said with new ears. And the more she observed, the more she realized he was trying. He kissed her goodbye in the mornings, asked about her day, laughed at her terrible jokes. Maybe he wasn't passionately in love with her, but he cared. He chose her every day. And that was when she realized the letter had been written in a moment of truth. But it wasn't the full truth. If he had truly wanted to leave, he would have. Instead, he had stayed. Not because of obligation, not just because of the kids, but because part of him still loved her, even if it wasn't the way it used to be. And wasn't that love, too? The choice to stay, to fight, to build something even after the fire of new romance had faded. But Lisa didn't just want to be chosen out of habit. She wanted more. So, one evening, after the kids had gone to bed, she pulled the letter from her pocket and placed it on the kitchen table. David froze when he saw it. His face paled, his fingers twitching slightly. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the attic," she said quietly. A long silence stretched between them. "Lisa, I have just told me the truth," she interrupted, her voice steady. "Did you mean it?" David ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. "I don't know," he admitted. "I did when I wrote it. But I didn't leave. Did I?" "No," she said, searching his eyes. "But do you love me?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Yes, but it's different now. I know," she whispered. And for the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge that different didn't have to mean broken. Maybe love wasn't always a raging fire. Maybe sometimes it was embers that needed tending. "I don't want us to just exist together," she said. "I want more, don't you?" His expression softened, and for the first time in a long time, he looked at her the way he used to. "Yes," he said, reaching for her hand. "I do." And just like that, something shifted. They weren't just going through the motions anymore. They were choosing to fight for something real, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but because, even after everything, they still wanted each other. And that was enough. Story 4. Rachel sat in the cafe, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, staring at the man she was supposed to be divorced from. Across from her, Jake looked just as unsettled, his fingers drumming against the table, his wedding ring, the one he should no longer be wearing, still on his finger. It had been 6 months since they had signed the divorce papers, 6 months since they had agreed to walk away from nearly a decade of marriage. 6 months since she had packed her things and left the home they built together. The love had faded, or so they thought. The constant fights, the silence between them, the way they had slowly become strangers in their own marriage, it all pointed to one inevitable conclusion: they weren't meant to be anymore. But as she sat there, facing the man she had loved for years, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the fact that seeing him against her is something deep in her chest. It was something more tangible, something wrong on paper. Because Rachel had just received an email from her lawyer that morning, the divorce had never been finalized. Somehow, due to an administrative error mix-up at the courthouse, a clerk who had forgotten to process a crucial document, their marriage had never been legally dissolved. His voice calm but uncertain. "What do we do now?" The answer should have been obvious. They had already made the decision. The logical next step was to sign the papers again, resubmit them, and finally close this chapter of their lives for good. But instead of saying that, Rachel hesitated. The truth was, in the last 6 months, she had expected to feel relief. She had expected freedom, clarity, the sense that she had made the right choice. But instead, she had felt empty. She had spent nights staring at her phone, fighting the urge to text him. She had found herself missing the little things, the way he always made sure her car had gas before she drove anywhere, the way he left a light on when she came home late, the way his side of the bed always smelled like cologne and warm. And now, staring at him, she could see it in his face. too. He had felt it, too. Maybe we should talk, she found herself saying, barely believing the words were coming out of her mouth. Jake arched an eyebrow. About what? About us, she said softly. I mean, don't you think it's kind of crazy, the fact that this happened? That we thought we were divorced, but we're not. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Rachel, a mistake doesn't change what we decided. I know, she admitted. But have you been happy? His jaw tightened. He didn't answer right away, and that was her answer. Over the next hour, they talked like they hadn't in years. Really talked. Not just surface-level pleasantries or passive-aggressive remarks, but real, raw honesty. They admitted things they hadn't before, how their fights had always been about something deeper, how they had both been too stubborn to fix what was breaking, how neither of them had truly wanted to let go. The worst part, they had never fallen out of love. They had just forgotten how to love each other. Jake looked down at the papers they had planned to re-sign, shaking his head. You know what's funny, he murmured. When I got the call from you today, I felt relieved. Like, maybe this was a sign that we weren't supposed to let this go yet. Rachel's breath hitched. I thought the same thing. They sat in silence, the weight of the moment settling between them. Then, slowly, Jake slid the divorce papers off the table, folded them in half, and tore them down the middle. Rachel gasped. Jake, we can always refile, he said. But what if we didn't? The words hung in the air. And suddenly, for the first time in a long time, Rachel felt hope. Maybe fate had given them one last chance. Maybe they weren't supposed to be over after all. Maybe, just maybe, their story wasn't finished yet. Story 5. Eleanor never thought she'd hear from Charles again. Not after their bitter divorce 2 years ago. Not after the years of cold silence and unresolved resentment that followed. He had built an empire, and she had walked away from it all, convinced that love had no place in his world of power and ambition. She had once been his everything, the woman he had promised the world to, the only one who knew the man behind the wealth, but somewhere along the way, he had changed. The nights got longer, the calls less frequent, and the love they once had faded beneath the weight of business deals and boardrooms. She had begged for his attention, fought for the man she once knew, but in the end, his empire won, and she lost. The divorce was swift, brutal, and final. She left with nothing but her dignity, and he kept everything: the company, the fortune, the legacy he had been building for decades, until today. Today, a letter arrived, sealed in an expensive black envelope, with Charles's name embossed in gold on the back. The handwriting wasn't his, it was from a lawyer. Confused, her hands trembled as she tore it open, her breath catching at the very first line. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, we regret to inform you that Mr. Charles Whitmore has passed away. Per his final wishes, you are to attend the reading of his will. Dead. Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs. Charles was invincible, or at least, that's how it had always seemed. He was the kind of man who conquered the world, not the kind who simply died. Yet, here it was, the end of his story. And somehow, she was still part of it. The next day, she arrived at the towering glass skyscraper that had once been her prison, escorted into a sleek conference room where lawyers in expensive suits waited with unreadable expressions. She wasn't alone. There were board members, executives, people who had once been part of his empire, but no family. Charles had no family, except, at one point, he had her. When the lawyer cleared his throat, the room fell silent. Mr. Whitmore left very specific instructions for his estate. He began, flipping through the pages. He had no surviving heirs, and as such, his assets valued at approximately $3.4 billion have been allocated according to his final wishes. Eleanor barely heard the number. Her mind was spinning, her pulse thrumming in her ears. What was she here? She had left. He had let her go. What could possibly be left for her now? And then the lawyer said something that made her breath itch. To Eleanor Whitmore, my first and only love, I leave the words blurred as her vision swam. What? Everyone in the room turned to look at her, whispers breaking out like ripples in water. Her stomach clenched as the lawyer continued reading. I leave the Whitmore estate, the Aspen property, and the personal bank account registered in her name an amount totaling $482 million. The room erupted, gasps, murmurs, someone cursed under their breath. But Eleanor, she sat frozen. He left her everything. Not the company, not the empire, but the parts that mattered, their home, their private retreat in the mountains. The fortune he had always said was for them. There's more, the lawyer added, flipping to the next page. Mr. Whitmore also left a letter, addressed personally to Mrs. Whitmore, a letter. Her fingers shook as she reached for the envelope. The world around her faded as she tore it open, revealing the last words of the man who had once held her heart. Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And if you're wondering why you're here, why you're still part of this, it's because I never stopped loving you. I know you won't believe that. I know I gave you every reason to think otherwise. I made mistakes once I can never take back, but I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped missing you. You were right about me. I was too obsessed with the empire, too blind to see that I was losing the only thing that ever really mattered. By the time I realized it, it was too late. You were already gone. I know I can't ask for forgiveness, but I can at least make sure you never have to worry again. I always wanted to take care of you, even when I didn't know how to love you properly. This is my last chance to do that. I hope you find happiness, Eleanor. The kind I was too much of a fool to give you. Always yours, Charles. The paper slipped from her hands, tears blurring her vision. She had spent so long believing he never truly cared, that she had meant nothing in the grand scheme of his life. But here it was, his final truth, written in his own hand. He had loved her. He had regretted everything. And now, he was gone. The money meant nothing. The houses, the estate, none of it mattered. What mattered was that she had spent years hating a man who had died loving her. The regret was crushing, the pain unbearable. And as she sat there, staring at the words of a ghost, she realized this was the goodbye she never got to have. Story 6. The moment Julia stepped onto the aisle, every whisper in the grand ballroom died down. Every gaze drawn to her like gravity itself had shifted. She looked radiant, poised, and absolutely breathtaking in a designer gown that hugged her figure perfectly, yet the only pair of eyes she sought were Greg's. The man who had shattered her, humiliated her, and walked away like their 12-year marriage had been nothing more than a disposable phase in his life. He sat in the front row, his entire body stiff, his hands gripping the edges of his chair as if he needed to hold on to something, anything to keep from falling apart. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her to move on so completely, so publicly, and so devastatingly. Because today wasn't just a wedding, it was her wedding. And Greg was about to realize, in the cruelest way possible, that he had made the worst mistake of his life. It had been exactly 18 months since Greg had destroyed Julia. She still remembered that evening vividly, how he had come home late, the smell of someone else's perfume clinging to his shirt, and the distant, almost bored look in his eyes when she confronted him. "Julia, don't be dramatic. It just happened." That was all he had said. 12 years of marriage, loyalty, sacrifice, and love reduced to 3 indifferent words. Julia had felt something inside her crack that night, something deep and irreparable. The next few weeks were a blur. Greg moved out almost immediately, taking nothing but his essentials and slipping seamlessly into his new life with her, a younger woman, his 26-year-old assistant. The same woman Julia had once invited into their home for a work dinner, completely unaware of what had already been happening behind her back. He didn't even have the decency to hide it. Within weeks, their relationship was plastered all over social media, expensive vacations, candlelit dinners, smug little captions about finding happiness, Julia, meanwhile, was left to pick up the pieces of a life she had spent over a decade building, alone. But fate had a way of balancing the scales. Greg had assumed Julia would never recover, that she would be stuck in bitterness, in loneliness, watching from the sidelines as he lived a better life without her. But Julia had something he never expected: resilience. At first, it was slow, small victories, getting out of bed without crying, going a full day without checking his social media, finally deleting the last picture of them together. And then came the real shift the moment she stopped surviving and started living. It happened at a charity gala, an event she had attended reluctantly, pushed by a friend who insisted she needed to start meeting people again. She had expected an awkward evening, forced small talk, and an overwhelming urge to leave. What she hadn't expected was Daniel Sinclair. Daniel was the kind of man who owned every room he walked into. Powerful, confident, completely self-assured. He wasn't just rich. He was the kind of rich that made Greg look like a small-time player. And the best part, he knew exactly who she was before she even introduced herself. Greg's ex-wife. But unlike everyone else, he didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with admiration. Daniel had known Greg for years. He had watched him climb the corporate ladder, stepping on people along the way, never caring about who he hurt. And when he learned what Greg had done to Julia, his interest shifted into something else entirely. A personal investment. Their first conversation had been polite. Their second, electrifying. Daniel wasn't like Greg. He didn't play games, didn't feed her pretty lies. He told her, outright, that she deserved better. That a woman like her should never have been treated like an afterthought. That if Greg had been stupid enough to throw her away, then maybe it was time someone else proved just how much she was worth. And that was how it all began. Now, as Julia stood at the altar, she could feel Greg's gaze burning into her, his breath unsteady, his entire world tilting on its axis. Because today, she wasn't just standing beside any man, she was standing beside his boss. The man who controlled his future, his promotions, his entire career trajectory. The man who now, for all intents and purposes, owned him. Greg had never seen it coming. Not the engagement announcement, not the wedding invitation, and certainly not this moment watching the woman he had discarded stand beside the most powerful man in the room, happier than she had ever been. His new girlfriend, the one he had risked everything for, shifted beside him, sensing the tension radiating from his body. She wasn't smiling anymore. She had noticed the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers curled into fists. She saw it, too, the regret, the panic, the realization that he had played himself. And for the first time, she probably wondered if she was next. The officiant's voice rang through the air. Do you, Julia, take Daniel to be your husband? She didn't hesitate, not for a second. I do. And just like that, it was over. Greg had lost. Completely, utterly, and permanently. His mistake was irreversible, his regret a wound that would never heal. He had traded in a woman who had given him everything for a fleeting thrill, and now he was the one left behind. The one watching someone else move on, the one trapped in a life he had chosen only to realize too late that he had chosen wrong. Julia turned to kiss her new husband, feeling an overwhelming sense of freedom. Not just from Greg, not just from the past, but from the version of herself that had once believed she wasn't enough. As their lips met, the ballroom erupted in applause, the sound of victory, of karma, of a love that had risen from the ashes of betrayal. She didn't glance at Greg. She didn't need to, because she already knew he would never recover from this. Story 7. It was the last thing Olivia expected to hear that evening. The phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was calm, even polite, but the words that followed shattered her reality. Ma'am, we've found something that belongs to you. She paused, confused, as her mind raced. It had been just another regular evening. She was at home, in the kitchen, preparing dinner for her husband, David, and their two children. David had worked late again, as he often did. The routine was almost comforting normal. Yet, in that moment, everything felt wrong. The phone call that started with such casualness didn't end that way. The voice continued, "We found a house, ma'am. A house that's registered under your husband's name. He's been paying for it for years." The blood drained from Olivia's face as the world around her seemed to blur. The reality of what she was hearing sinking in with excruciating slowness. A house. David had always been a loving husband, the kind of man who came home every evening after work, helped with the kids, and seemed to cherish the life they'd built together. But this call, this one simple phrase, sent her entire world spiraling into a dark abyss of confusion and disbelief. What house? She had never heard of it, never seen it. The voice on the other end continued, "We're just confirming some details. Would you like us to send you the address?" Olivia's hands trembled as she fumbled for words, the confusion settling into a sharp, bitter feeling. This wasn't right. David had always been so open with her, so involved in their family life. Why would he have a house that she didn't know about, and why had no one ever mentioned it? The questions flooded her mind like a tidal wave, but the worst part, she knew deep down, in her gut, that this wasn't some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. David had been hiding something from her, and whatever it wasn't something small. The house was a secret, hidden in plain sight. She hung up the phone and sat down heavily on the couch, staring at the screen of her phone as her thoughts raced uncontrollably. The house. Why had he been paying for it? Who else could be involved? She didn't know where to begin, but there was only one person who could provide the answers. David. When he arrived home later that night, it was as though nothing had changed. He walked in with his usual smile, greeting her with a kiss and asking how her day had gone. But Olivia couldn't ignore the knots twisting in her stomach. How could he act so normal? How could he stand there, pretending like nothing was wrong when she was carrying the weight of a revelation that was breaking her apart? She couldn't wait any longer. As he began to pour himself a drink, she stood up and faced him, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Where is it?" "David." He stopped, mid-sip, his eyes flicking up to meet hers. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut through. She didn't need to ask again. His reaction said everything. He had been caught. "Olivia, I can explain," he began, his voice unsteady. But she wasn't listening. Explain. After all these years, after all the love they had shared, he was standing here, attempting to offer an explanation for a secret so monumental that it felt like her world was crumbling to pieces. She tried to hold it together, but the tears came anyway, tears of betrayal, confusion, and disbelief. She had never thought, not in a million years, that David was capable of something like this. How long had he been lying to her? Who was he, really? After all the love they had shared, he was standing here, attempting to offer an explanation for a secret so monumental that it felt like her world was crumbling to pieces. She tried to hold it together, but the tears came anyway, tears of betrayal, confusion, and disbelief. She had never thought, not in a million years, that David was capable of something like this. How long had he been lying to her? Who was he, really? David had always been the picture of the devoted husband, the loving father. They'd bought a house together, had children, worked through their problems. Everything seemed perfect, or at least as close to perfect as anyone could get. And now this a secret life hidden behind her back, a life she had never even suspected. David, still standing in the doorway, seemed to read her mind. He walked slowly towards her, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. She couldn't touch him. Not now, not after what she'd learned. His face softened, the guilt evident in his eyes, and for the first time in their entire marriage, Olivia saw him not as the man she had built a life with, but as a stranger. He was a stranger in the life she thought they shared, and the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had no idea who this man really was. He sighed, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you, Olivia. Something I should have told you a long time ago." She shook her head, refusing to believe anything he said could justify the betrayal, the lies. But she was also afraid to hear the truth. Was there another woman? Was he seeing someone else in that house? The thought twisted her insides, and for a brief moment she wondered if she could even bear to hear it. But she had to know. She deserved to know the truth. David finally spoke, his voice cracking with guilt. "I didn't want you to find out like this. I thought I could keep it from you, but I can't lie to you anymore." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been living a double life. I've had this house for years now, but it's not what you think. There's no other woman. I've been seeing a therapist." Olivia blinked, confused. "A therapist? What did that even mean?" He explained, his voice trembling as he revealed the truth. He had been struggling with deep issues for years, things that he had never shared with her, a previous trauma, a mental health crisis. He had used the house as a place to retreat, to get away from everything, the pressures of work, the responsibilities of family, the feeling that he was suffocating under the weight of his own mind. Olivia stood there, her thoughts spinning. It wasn't the affair she had imagined, but that didn't make it any easier. The betrayal wasn't in another woman. It was in the secrecy, in the fact that David had chosen to hide his pain from her for all this time, pretending everything was fine while carrying this massive burden alone. She had been kept in the dark, excluded from a part of his life so critical, so personal, that it made her question everything she thought she knew about their relationship. How had he thought he could keep this from her forever? The betrayal cut deep, not because of the affair, but because of the trust he had broken by not being honest. It felt as though he had been living a life she wasn't a part of, a life that had been hidden from her for so long. And in that moment, Olivia realized that it wasn't just the house that had been a secret. Their entire marriage had been built on lies, on half-truths and omissions. She had loved the man she thought she knew, but now she realized that he had been a stranger to her, too. Olivia didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: everything had changed. The trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship was shattered, and no amount of explanation could ever fix that. She wasn't sure what the next step would be, or if they could ever find a way forward from here. But she did know one thing: she deserved the truth, and she would never stop demanding it. She wasn't sure if she could forgive him, or if she even wanted to. But as the silence stretched between them, she knew that one thing had changed forever. Her life was no longer the same. Story 8. It had been years since Sarah last thought about him, the one person who had once held her heart, the person who had left without a word, without any explanation. She had moved on, built a life, married, had children, and yet there was always that lingering ache in the corner of her mind, a mystery she had never truly been able to let go. It wasn't until she received the letter that everything changed. The envelope was old, the edges frayed, the handwriting unfamiliar yet hauntingly recognizable. To Sarah, from an old friend, the words were simple, but they carried with them the weight of 1,000 unspoken emotions. She held the letter in her hands, her heart racing as memories flooded back, memories of a summer long ago when love had been young, wild, and full of promise. How could this be possible? Her mind raced as she sat down on the couch, the world around her fading away as she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable, and with every word, she was transported back to that time, to that place, to the boy she had once loved more than anything. The letter was from Ethan, the man who had disappeared from her life without a trace, leaving her heartbroken and confused. "Sarah, I know it's been a long time, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I can't keep living with the guilt of how I left. I've thought about you every single day since that summer, and I've never stopped wondering what could have been. I don't even know if you still think about me, but if there's a chance that you do, if there's even the smallest part of you that remembers the love we shared, I need you to know that I've never stopped loving you. I've made mistakes. I've hurt you, but I'm asking for a second chance. If you're open to it, if you can find it in your heart to forgive me, I'd like to see you again. I'll be waiting." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the letter again, disbelief and emotions she hadn't felt in years swirling inside her. The letter had come out of nowhere, like a ghost from the past, and it shattered everything she thought she knew about her own life. She had spent so many years pushing the memory of Ethan away, locking it in a box deep inside her heart, never allowing herself to truly mourn what could have been. And now, here he was, asking for a second chance, asking for forgiveness. Could she even give it to him? Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, but one thing was clear: Ethan had never truly left her heart. She thought about how he had vanished without a trace, leaving her with nothing but unanswered questions. She had never understood why he left or what had happened to make him walk away from everything they had. In the years that followed, she had convinced herself that it didn't matter, that he wasn't worth her time or energy, that she had moved on, and that life had gone on without him. She had built a family, had children, and found happiness in a way she never thought possible after Ethan's departure. But now this letter, this plea for forgiveness, was bringing it all back. The love they had shared was a memory, a beautiful, heartbreaking memory that had been tucked away for so long. She had never told anyone about Ethan, never shared the pain of his departure, and had never allowed herself to wonder what could have been. But as she sat there, holding the letter, the past came rushing back like a floodgate had been opened, and she found herself wondering whether she had truly moved on, or if part of her had always been waiting for this moment. She couldn't deny that a part of her wanted to see him again, to hear his voice, to understand why he had left. But was it too late? Could she even entertain the thought of a second chance with someone who had once abandoned her? Was forgiveness possible after all this time? Her heart ached at the thought of it. She had a family now, a husband who loved her, children who depended on her. Could she risk everything for the chance to rekindle something that had ended so painfully years ago? And yet, the thought of seeing Ethan again stirred something deep inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. It was the ache of a love lost, the hope for something that might have been. She could feel her emotions pulling her into different directions, one side telling her to let the past go, to leave it buried where it belonged, and the other side urging her to find closure, to see Ethan one last time, and to understand why he had walked away. The letter sat on the table in front of her, the words searing into her mind, burning with the intensity of the emotions they had stirred. Sarah knew that if she agreed to see him again, it would change everything. She would be reopening a chapter of her life that she had spent so long trying to forget. The consequences of meeting Ethan could be far-reaching, affecting not just her, but her family as well. She thought about her husband, who had been by her side for years, who had supported her through everything. She loved him, but a part of her couldn't deny the pull of the past, the curiosity about what could have been. But would meeting Ethan mean she was betraying her current life, her family, her marriage? Could she really go back to someone who had abandoned her so easily? The letter wasn't just a request for a second chance, it was a reminder of the pain she had endured, a reminder of a love that had been lost in time. But it also represented something more: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for redemption, for healing, and for a love that could withstand the test of time. As she pondered the decision, Sarah realized that the letter wasn't just a plea from Ethan. It was a call to herself, a call to confront her own feelings, to face the parts of her heart that she had buried for so long. She had to decide if she could truly forgive, if she could truly let go of the past and move forward, or if she was willing to take a risk and see what might be waiting for her. The next few days were a blur of confusion and indecision. She didn't know what to do, how to respond, or even if she should respond at all. The thought of seeing Ethan again haunted her, yet the fear of what it might do to her life kept her from taking action. Finally, after days of agonizing over it, Sarah made the decision. She would meet him, but only to get answers. only to close the door on the past once and for all. She picked up the phone and dialed the number written on the letter. Her hands were shaking as she heard the familiar voice on the other end, the voice that had once been the love of her life. "Ethan," she said softly, "I'll meet you." And with that, the door to the past was open. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain: this was the beginning of something new. Story 9. It's a feeling that lingers, gnawing at your soul, a constant reminder of a decision made, a choice taken, and the weight of the one thing you can never undo, letting go of the one person who truly understood you. For Olivia, that person was Aaron. They met when they were both young, free, and filled with dreams of the future. The connection between them was instant, undeniable, like a spark that lit a fire neither of them could extinguish. Every conversation felt like an adventure, every glance an unspoken promise of something more. They were inseparable, and for a while, it felt as though nothing could tear them apart. But life, as it often does, got in the way. Aaron was the kind of person who believed in living life fully, embracing the present moment, and chasing every opportunity that came his way. Olivia, on the other hand, was more cautious, more grounded. She had a vision for her future, one that didn't always align with Aaron's spontaneous nature. They both had dreams that took them in different directions, and it wasn't long before the gap between them began to widen. As their relationship grew, so did the tension. Olivia wanted stability, a sense of security, a clear path forward, while Aaron wanted adventure, excitement, and the thrill of the unknown. They argued about their future, about what they wanted from life, and, inevitably, about their relationship. Olivia's heart was torn. She loved Aaron more than anything, but she couldn't ignore the pull of her own desires, her own ambitions. She had always been the responsible one, the one who planned for the future, and she couldn't reconcile that with Aaron's carefree attitude. It felt like they were onto separate paths, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't seem to find a way to walk together. The final blow came when Aaron received an offer to travel abroad for work, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that would propel his career forward. It was everything he had ever dreamed of, but it was also the thing that would tear them apart. Olivia knew that she couldn't ask him to stay, not when it was his dream. But she also couldn't ignore the fact that it would mean the end of their relationship. The night before Aaron left, they sat together, the weight of the unspoken words hanging heavy between them. It was a night full of regrets, full of what-ifs, but neither of them knew how to say the things they were both feeling. In the end, Aaron left, and Olivia stayed behind, her heart broken, but resigned to the fact that it was the right decision. They parted ways with no promises, no commitments, just a quiet understanding that their lives were taking them in different directions. Olivia threw herself into her work, into the life she had built without Aaron. She moved on, or at least, she thought she did. She married someone else, had children, and created a life that looked perfect on the outside. But every so often, when the quiet moments came, when the world slowed down, her mind would wander back to Aaron. She would remember his laugh, the way he made her feel like she could do anything, the way he held her when the world felt too heavy. There was a part of her that never fully let go of him, and that part only grew stronger with time. As the years passed, Olivia tried to forget, tried to convince herself that she had made the right choice, that Aaron was a part of her past, something she had outgrown. But the truth was, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something missing, something she would never be able to replace. She tried to bury those feelings, to suppress the what-ifs, but they were always there, lurking in the background, a quiet ache that refused to go away. Then, one day, out of the blue, she received a message from Aaron. The message was simple, just a few words, but it was enough to send her heart racing. "I'm back in town. I'd love to see you if you're free." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen Aaron in years, hadn't heard from him in even longer, and now here he was, reaching out, wanting to reconnect. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: excitement, fear, guilt, and longing. She couldn't deny the pull she still felt toward him, the part of her that had never truly let go. But she was married now, with a family, a life she had built without him. Was it fair to her husband, to her children, to even entertain the idea of meeting with Aaron? The more she thought about it, the more the what-ifs began to flood her mind. What if this was the chance she had missed all those years ago? What if Aaron was the one who got away, the one who could have been her everything? What if she still loved him, deep down, and hadn't even realized it until now? She spent hours thinking about it, going back and forth between wanting to see him and knowing she shouldn't. The temptation was overwhelming, but the guilt weighed heavily on her. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to reconcile the woman she had become with the girl who had once been in love with Aaron. In the end, she made the decision. She would see him just once to get closure, to see if there was anything left of the connection they once shared. It wasn't about love. It wasn't about rekindling. What they had, it was about understanding, about closure, about figuring out what had gone wrong all those years ago. When they met, the years melted away. The moment she saw him, the same spark she had felt all those years ago ignited again. He hadn't changed much. His hair was a little grayer, his face a little older, but in his eyes, she saw the same boy she had fallen in love with. The conversation flowed easily, like no time had passed at all. They talked about their lives, their families, their careers, but the underlying current was always there, the unspoken, undeniable truth that they had once shared something incredible. It wasn't long before Olivia realized that the feelings she had for Aaron were still there, buried deep inside her. But she also realized something else, that those feelings, while real, didn't belong in her life anymore. She was a different person now, with a different life, and what they had was in the past, where it belonged. She said goodbye to Aaron that day, not with sadness, but with a sense of peace, knowing that she had finally let go of the one that got away. The regrets, the what-ifs, the longing, all of it faded as she walked away, knowing that she had made the right choice all those years ago. But as she returned to her life, to her family, Olivia couldn't help but wonder, what if? Story 10. It's the kind of story that makes you question everything you think you know about success, about failure, and about the unexpected twists that life throws at you, because what if your darkest moment was actually your biggest blessing? This is the story of Claire, a woman who had it all, or at least she thought she did. For years, she had been married to Thomas, a wealthy businessman whose name was known in every high-end restaurant and luxury store across the city. Their life together seemed perfect on the outside. A sprawling mansion in the most prestigious neighborhood, exotic vacations, designer clothes, and all the trappings of wealth that anyone could dream of. Claire had everything she could have ever wanted except happiness. Thomas, despite his charm and success, was a man driven by ego and ambition. He saw Claire not as a partner, but as an accessory to his life of success, a trophy wife to complement his image. Over the years, Claire began to feel more like a prisoner in her own home than the beloved wife of a powerful man. His controlling nature, his constant demands, and his cold indifference began to chip away at her self-esteem. It wasn't just the emotional neglect. It was the realization that she had sacrificed her own dreams, her own identity, for a marriage that no longer felt like a partnership, but a business arrangement. She had given up her career aspirations, her friendships, her passions, all to maintain the image of the perfect wife. But behind the closed doors of their luxurious home, Clara was lonely, miserable, and suffocating under the weight of a life that was not her own. It was when Claire discovered that Thomas had been unfaithful again that something inside her snapped. She had tolerated his arrogance, his neglect, and his control, but this betrayal was the final straw. The discovery wasn't just about the affair. It was the moment she realized that she had been living a lie. She had given everything to a man who didn't see her as more than a possession, and in return, he had treated her like a commodity, something that could be easily replaced when it no longer suited him. With a quiet, determined resolve, Claire made the decision to leave. She filed for divorce, knowing that it would cost her everything: her luxurious lifestyle, her social status, her comfortable future. But for the first time in years, she didn't care. She wanted her freedom, and she was willing to fight for it. Thomas, of course, was furious. He didn't take kindly to being challenged, especially by a woman he had always seen as beneath him. He fought the divorce every step of the way, trying to manipulate and control the proceedings. But Claire was no longer the woman who would shrink in the face of his aggression. She fought back with a fierce determination that surprised even herself. Throughout the divorce process, Thomas tried to use his wealth and power to intimidate her, offering her a large settlement to go away quietly. But Claire wasn't interested in money anymore. She wanted independence, respect, and control over her own life. She refused to take the easy way out. As the proceedings dragged on, Claire began to realize that she had more than just her freedom to gain. She had the chance to rebuild her life from the ground up, to find out who she was outside of her marriage, and to pursue the dreams that had been buried for so long. She took a chance, a risk that many people might have thought foolish, and decided to invest in a business idea. She had always been passionate about designing and selling her own line of eco-friendly home decor. She started small, using the savings from her divorce settlement in her business, and quickly discovered that she had a talent for it. Her designs were unique, elegant, and sustainable, and word of mouth spread quickly. What started as a small venture in the basement of her home soon exploded into a full-fledged business, with Claire's brand becoming a staple in high-end homes across the country. As her business grew, so did her confidence. She had gone from being a woman defined by her marriage to a woman who was defining herself on her own terms. She was no longer just Mrs. Thomas, but Claire, the successful entrepreneur who had built something from nothing. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her divorce, which had seemed like the end of everything, had turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to her. She not only gained financial independence, but she gained a sense of self-worth, a purpose, and the ability to look at herself in the mirror and see someone who was proud of what she had accomplished. Claire's business continued to flourish, and before long, she was able to buy a beautiful new home, one that she could call her own, without the shadow of her former husband hanging over her. She traveled, met new people, and built a new life that was full of possibilities. Her brand grew into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, and she became a sought-after speaker at business conferences, sharing her story of reinvention and empowerment. But perhaps the most surprising part of her journey was when Thomas came back into her life, years after their divorce. By then, Claire had moved on completely. She was no longer the woman who had once begged for his affection, the woman who had tolerated his cruelty in exchange for material comfort. No, now she was a powerful, successful businesswoman who had found her strength and independence. When Thomas tried to re-enter her life, hoping to rekindle some semblance of their past relationship, Claire turned him away without hesitation. She had learned the hard way that there was nothing he could offer her anymore, and that the life she had built for herself was far more fulfilling than anything he could ever provide. In a twist of fate, the very man who had once treated her as disposable was now trying to win her back, but it was too late. Claire had already moved on, and she was richer in more ways than one. She had gained her freedom, her success, and most importantly, her dignity. The divorce that had once seemed like a devastating loss had ultimately been the catalyst for Claire's greatest triumph, a reminder that sometimes the most painful moments in life are the ones that lead to the greatest rewards. The woman who had been abandoned, betrayed, and left with nothing had become the woman who owned everything.